This is a download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Hello. Did you know that the new Director of Public Prosecutions in England and Wales makes a mean tarte tatin? Do you care? Last week's Radio 4 profile spent a large proportion of the programme discussing Alison Saunders' baking skills, leaving many listeners simmering with rage.
Or is there really nothing to explore about the woman, apart from her baking ability and love of Beyoncé? The programme left a nasty taste in my mouth.
The programme's editor tells us why the programme spent so much time talking cakes, not cases.
Her oldest friend told us that in order to deal with the sort of rather grisly nature of the kinds of cases she's had to deal with, she focuses her energy into cooking and baking and entertaining as a kind of escape. So it is relevant.
Also, a poignant return to the airwaves for Andrew Marr as he restarts Start the Week.
Hello. In the 10 years to 2011, the number of people in this country who defined themselves as Christian dropped from...
Many thanks to Andrew for making it back to Radio 4.
And how to speak for 60 seconds without hesitation, deviation or repetition when you're only 12 years old.
Then my dad comes to get me again and tells me off over and again.
More from Kitty Fry later. But first, your starter for 10. Will English, Welsh or Irish people be able to vote in Scotland's independence referendum? The answer is yes, if they are resident in Scotland. Will all Scots who are 16 and over get a referendum vote? No, not if they reside outside Scotland. Not many people know that, but they will if the BBC has anything to do with it. The referendum is only 10 months away, and its consequences, though in part a matter of conjecture, could be momentous for everyone living in these islands. For example, if Scotland does vote yes, there will be no United Kingdom, at least as presently constituted, for Northern Ireland to be part of. And what will happen to the British Broadcasting Corporation? There will be just one simple yes-no question. Should Scotland be an independent country? And the BBC has promised extensive coverage of what it calls the biggest story in Scotland's history for 300 years. But it also knows that campaigners on both sides will be minutely examining every aspect of that coverage for perceived bias, not to say self-interest. It's going to be a tricky balancing act. And the man charged with ensuring that the BBC maintains due impartiality on the issue is the BBC's chief political advisor, Rick Bailey.
It's clearly of greatest interest to the people who are voting next September about the future of Scotland, but it is also about the future of the United Kingdom. And we've already seen, for instance, last week with the story about the shipyards and Portsmouth, for instance, that what's happening in Scotland does have reverberations around the UK. And it's not just about yes or no in the question of the Scottish referendum, but it's a whole series of other things. And we'll want to explore that. In covering this, we'll have lots of impartiality issues, and it'll absolutely be the BBC's objective to be impartial in this. It's vital that we're impartial in this. It's a really important, critical moment, and we have to be impartial, but we mustn't make that see everything through just this sort of yes-no political prism. There are so many more aspects to it.
But how can you be impartial when, in a sense, the future of the BBC is at stake? Because there can't be a British Broadcasting Corporation, can there, with an independent Scotland?
That clearly is one of the issues that comes out of independence. There are lots of British and UK institutions which our journalists, and indeed the media as a whole, will want to look at in the context of what's happening in Scotland. I think it's very important that the BBC as an organisation doesn't get involved in that debate and waits until people have actually voted and heard what they have to say. But that doesn't mean BBC journalists won't want to get into those issues about not just the future of broadcasting, the future of economy, the future of the military and so on. All of those UK institutions are part of the story, and we'll want to get into them.
But if I'm in Scotland, one of the questions I might want the answer to is, what will happen to broadcasting if there is independence? And therefore I'd be expecting the BBC to outline its plans for itself in the event of a yes vote. Will you do that?
No, absolutely not. It's absolutely legitimate, of course, to ask those questions, and our journalists may well ask that and explore it in the same way as they would explore any other of those questions. But I don't think the BBC as an organisation should risk entering that fray until people have voted, because that, I think, would risk the BBC's impartiality.
Can we then look at the programme making? Now, Radio 4's just run a 5-part series on the history of Scottish nationalism. and listener Bill Brahm was surprised by the choice of presenter.
I thought Professor Murray Pittock was an interesting choice to write this programme, a prominent supporter of the Vote Yes caucus, hardly someone who's likely to present an impartial view. The series seemed to have an SNP subtext. Why is the BBC broadcasting this nationwide?
Well, I heard that series and I thought it was a really good historical, critical, analytical account by Professor Pittock, who is actually one of the, if not the foremost authorities on the history of Scottish nationalism. And I would defy anybody to find a breath of anything other than absolutely a balanced, factual account, going back over 1,000 years.
But he has written saying that he would vote yes.
Yes, but I think most people in Scotland will be thinking about which way they're going to vote. I would say that what you need to do is to listen to the programme, and you would not find anything in the content there that was anything other than an absolutely spot-on, absolutely fascinating account going back over hundreds of years of Scottish history, bringing it up to the present.
Of course, some people would say, well, there is an alternative. You simply get a history made by people who support the yes vote and a history made by somebody who supports the no vote.
Well, I think, actually, if you listen to the programme, I think anybody who didn't support independence would have difficulty finding anything they disagreed with in it. But I would also go back to the point about this not all being seen simply through a yes-no prism. I think if we're going to do justice to the listeners over quite a long period of 10 months or more, I think what we want to hear is lots of different views from a whole range of perspectives and different layers of the story, and enrich the listener's experience. And I think to do that, you want to come at it from different perspectives. So, for instance, there's going to be a series on Radio 4 in the new year about Britishness. So all of these things are coming to the fore because of what's happening in Scotland, but you don't necessarily want to go into a strict balancing act on a set of scales.
Now, only people who are resident in Scotland will have the vote in the referendum. Scots who are resident in London just have to put up with watching what's going on. But it is an issue that affects the whole of the UK, and some of our listeners feel the coverage of the debate has been too narrow so far.
Graham Wally. I continue to be bemused by the absence of any discussion on the BBC, including Radio 4, on the concerns of the wider UK over Scottish independence. Week after week, your news and current affairs programmes treat this as a purely Scottish issue, when in fact it is of great interest to the rest of us, especially in terms of what Scottish independence will cost the whole of the UK.
Neil Welton. What plans do the BBC have to ensure that the opinions of people in Northern Ireland and Wales are fully, adequately and properly represented in the Scottish independence debate? We've heard rather a lot about England and the United Kingdom Parliament in the debate so far, but very little from the other constituent parts of the UK.
Can I pick up that point then about, Northern Ireland, people in Northern Ireland and Wales not being fully represented in the debate? Will they be?
Obviously, this is something of particular resonance if you're voting in Scotland, but it's a big issue which we will want to involve the audience in around the UK, and much of that will focus on the relationship of the different countries. But this has a particular resonance in both Northern Ireland and in Wales, and already I think there's probably evidence that people there have picked up on this more quickly, and that our services there are already engaged in that and are covering it in a slightly different way. But I think that's part of the point, is that across this 10 months or so, there will be many different elements we want to cover. Not just what happens in Scotland, what the relationship is with England, and absolutely Northern Ireland and Wales as well.
And what happens if some scheduler puts up Mel Gibson's Braveheart film and suggests that it's run in the next few months? Will you say don't run it?
Well, part of my job is to work with the schedulers and work with commissioners, which I'm doing all the time.
And will you tell them not to run that movie?
Well, I haven't had that suggestion, so I better not enter.
Let me put it to you. You've seen it. We've all seen it. Is it appropriate to run such a movie before the referendum?
Interestingly, most of the answers I give to schedulers begin with, it depends, because what I'm doing a lot of the time is looking at the context, I'm looking at what else is going out, I'm looking at a whole range of things in advising them about what due impartiality means. So there's very rarely a yes or no answer to any of these questions.
There are obviously lots of great programming opportunities, but there are lots of possibilities for disasters and mistakes, and what is absolutely guaranteed is that those who feel they're losing the argument are going to blame you. Do you look forward to that?
There's something about referendums, partly because they're binary and it's a one-off, that people feel absolutely passionately about that. The BBC and the way we report it is a very big part of that. And inevitably, that will involve editorial judgments that people will dispute. And we will have some bumpy moments. But I think if we have got to a position next September where people in Scotland and in the rest of the UK really understand these issues and are in a position to express a view about it, then we'll have done our job.
the BBC's chief political adviser, Rick Bailey, and the draft editorial guidelines on how the BBC should cover the Scottish referendum have been put out for public consultation by the BBC Trust. Details on how to have your say on our website. Now, one of Scotland's famous sons, Andrew Marr, without a referendum vote as he's resident in London, returned to Radio 4 this week, 10 months after suffering a stroke. Many listeners were delighted to welcome him back.
Hello, this is Heather Neake-Millen. I just want to register my delight on switching on the radio this morning and hearing Andrew Marr start the week.
Why is it that religious poetry and religious music seem to matter more than ever? For me, it's a personal question, because since my stroke, I found myself, though I am not religious, turning to the poetry of Christian writers such as T.S. Eliot, Wendell Berry, and in particular, George Herbert. And the music...
Many thanks to Andrew for making it back to Radio 4.
My name is Sebastian Verney. For one thing, hearing Andrew Marr again was simply marvellous, but also then John Taverner.
Now, since I've been ill, like you, I've been looking back on my life a lot, and the Presbyterian origins are actually quite strong in me, because I knew the most wonderful pastor.
We're surrounded by so much materialism, and a lot of that materialism is very evident in the way Radio 4 has gone. And this was a complete contrast, pinpointed in a way by Taverner. He represents everything that I feel we as human beings should be interested in.
Yeah, when I heard the Arabic words for God, I walked around the garden and thought about them and said them to myself. Then suddenly the music appeared. It was extraordinary.
There's a depth in the man that was so clear, really, in listening to him. 24 hours later, we learned that he had just died, which makes it all the more poignant. But the whole combination of three excellent speakers and the excellent Andrew Marr was just such a phenomenal experience for me in the midst of, well, I shouldn't say things about the rest of Radio 4, but this did stand out as an absolute jewel.
Sebastian Verney speaking for many. Now, Alison Saunders recently took up her post as the Director of Public Prosecutions. It makes her the most senior prosecutor in England and Wales, with overall responsibility for the estimated 800,000 cases taken by the Crown Prosecution Service every year. Are you interested to know that she also makes a light and fluffy cheesecake? I know that because I listened to last week's profile on Radio 4. It was full of references to Miss Saunders' culinary skills. Many listeners were left bemused by reporter Becky Milligan's apparent obsession with the new DPP's baking abilities and liking for Beyoncé.
My name's Carol Richmond from Chichester in West Sussex. I thought I had tuned into a profile programme about the new Director of Public Prosecutions, Alison Saunders, but must have misunderstood something and listened to an extended promotion for the Great British Bake Off.
For Alison, it's always the food that's the sort of pivotal point of the evening. I mean, she's great, particularly focused on desserts, as I always remember, which is partly my waistline has suffered over the years.
Is there really nothing to explore about the woman, apart from her baking ability and love of Beyoncé? I can't recall a profile of any male that concentrated quite so much on domestic attributes. The programme left a nasty taste in my mouth.
My name's Fiona Borden. At one point, the presenter even asked the former Solicitor General, Edward Garnier, if she'd ever baked for him, which is just an incredible question to ask about the most senior prosecutor in the land.
I have unfortunately never had one of her cakes, but I do intend to introduce her to my constituent who's just won the Great British Bake Off.
Women in senior positions in public life have enough difficulty being taken seriously without this kind of fluff, and for free from the BBC.
Hello, my name's Margaret Lipsey. The whole profile came over as sexist and lacking seriousness. The implication was that Miss Saunders was rather a boring person whom Miss Milligan had problems finding things to talk about. This was not the usual standard of profile, and it is something I do not expect from the BBC.
So why did the programme decide to focus so much on Alison Saunders' achievements in the kitchen, rather than her record in the courtroom? A question for the editor of Profile, Richard Knight.
Well, I would say that we devoted that time to her personal life. And I think, to go back to your listeners, one of them said they felt we focused on her domestic attributes. And I really wonder whether that, in fact, isn't the more sexist thing to think. I mean, we didn't think we were focusing on her domestic attributes. We thought we were focusing on what she does in her personal life. And what she does in her personal life, according to those closest to her who we interviewed, is entertain, cook, bake. It's a really big deal in her life. And
that justifies a proportion of the programme being on that, but after 10 minutes into your profile, having started it with her baking skills, you returned to it, which is rather strange.
Well, it's a fairly normal radio device to have a tease at the top and then go back to a theme.
Well, it was longer than a tease because it was at the front and then it came back again. I mean, there were things about her personal life we didn't learn. We did learn rather a lot about baking.
Well, I think in the end with profile, you have to play the hand you're dealt. And it might be worth explaining how the profile programme comes together. We generally decide who we're going to profile on a Tuesday. So we have a few days to pull together the programme. We go and try and find those closest to the profilee, and we try to ask them the most interesting questions we can to try and yield the most profound insights, because this isn't an audio version of a Wikipedia entry or a CV. It's trying to give a rounded portrait of a person. Then, by Friday afternoon, you look at what you've got and you decide what to do with it. Now, in this case, unusually, and I happily admit surprisingly, we had a lot of material about entertaining, cooking and baking. This was not because we sought it. This is because people talked to us about it a lot. There were even times in interviews where Becky tried to get away from it, and it led back to it. It became a fairly pronounced theme in the programme, but that's because it was a fairly pronounced theme in the interviews we'd gathered.
Well, I wonder if you missed the real story, because listener Jenny Hawke asks,
where were the questions about how she got to be DPP, and what were her beliefs and values?
So where were they?
Well, I think all that stuff was actually in there. We talked about why she became a barrister. We talked about her early career at the CPS when the CPS was new. We interviewed her first boss and mentor at the time. We talked about her approach to the work. We talked about the most important cases she's been involved with. It was in there, I'm afraid, that anybody who thinks it wasn't is just wrong.
Well, they would have heard if they'd listened to the Watto interview earlier, when she'd been appointed and talking specifically about some of the issues of abuse and so on, that you would learn quite a lot about her and about her views and serious concerns, and those weren't included in the profile. Is that because you took account of the Watto interview, or...?
Well, profile has a different function, and I feel quite strongly that the programme does have to try to present some sort of insight into the character of the person. Now, sometimes that's relatively easy to do. Sometimes it isn't. In her case, she's a very private person. Everyone we spoke to says she never discusses cases with them or outside work. And in terms of other things that she does outside of work, we didn't find much. Now,
well, you didn't find the fact that her husband's a lawyer, and that I wanted to know as a listener, for example, what sort of lawyer he was. If you're married to the DPP or the person who becomes DPP, what sort of law can you practice? Those would have been interesting issues. The fact that she did have children. I left your profile with the thought that she probably doesn't have children and lives alone.
Well, in the end, you have to, as I say, work with what you get, and you have to decide what goes in. Now, the best sort of personal insight speaks to how the person functions in the job. Now, at first glance, you might think that to talk about her passion for entertaining has nothing to do with it, but then on second glance, one has to wonder whether that's really true. So, for example, her oldest friend told us that in order to deal with the sort of rather grisly nature of the kinds of cases she's had to deal with throughout her careers at the CPS, she compartmentalises, to use her word, and focuses her energy into cooking and baking and entertaining as a kind of escape. So it is relevant.
Well, except that some of our listeners say you wouldn't have done that if it was a man, and specifically they say the programme is rather sexist. Neil Oliver asked whether the profile of Alison Saunders' predecessor, Keir Starmer, told us whether he could fix bicycle tyres or lawnmowers or bake bread.
Well, there was football and music in that profile. We didn't choose that Alison Saunders should give a considerable amount of her attention in her personal life to entertaining and baking. Had we been told by her closest friends that she devoted great energy to more stereotypically male pursuits, that would have been a dominant theme. We have tried harder and harder to create a more rounded programme which reads between the lines and yields some nuggets of information, hopefully profound, about the person we're profiling. Now, sometimes that works better than other times.
Did it work well on this occasion, in your view?
I don't think it did work particularly well, because we didn't get the sort of startling revelation in that programme that ultimately I would like. But it may be because it doesn't exist. A couple of weeks ago we did a profile of Andrew Mitchell. It's a difficult programme to do.
The
Becky
Conservative
Milligan,
former Chief Whip.
Yeah, exactly, yes. And Becky interviewed his daughter for that programme. It was, I think, by a wide margin, the most revealing and compelling and absorbing interview about the whole Plebgate affair so far broadcast. It can really work.
So in this case, you're saying that the programme wasn't a great success, but you're still denying that it was sexist in any way.
It unequivocally was not sexist. I mean, I wonder if it's even a stereotypically feminine pursuit, baking. I mean, Paul Hollywood, I would imagine, would disagree for a start. Was it successful? Well, actually, I was quite proud of this programme, and I defend it.
Richard Knight, editor of Radio 4's Profile. Now, last week, listener David Savage got in touch with us about Jane Garvey's recent series getting on air, The Female Pioneers. He said the debate around it reminded him of the furore over the appointment of Susan Ray as an announcer on Radio 4 back in 1983. He told us he'd written to Feedback at the time to express his support for Susan and had received a charming letter in reply, all of which prompted listener Andrew Walmsley to go a step further.
I'm a collector of older radio programmes. I have an archive that goes back 30-odd years. I'd come across one particular tape, it was a few weeks ago, and it needed repairing. So at the weekend, I sort of spliced it back together again, and it had an old edition of Feedback on it from 1983.
And now, Feedback, the programme that voices listeners' views on BBC output and policy.
And the very first item on the programme, which in those days was presented by Colin Semper, was about a new announcer on Radio 4, Susan Ray.
Good morning. Don't go away, Susan, for last week you were the cause of complaint.
I realised that I'd actually heard something about Susan only a day or two before on Feedback, 30 years practically to the day.
I never write to the editors of the BBC, shame on you. But I felt prompted to write and say, what a delight to hear Susan. Sincerely.
So I spliced the two pieces of audio together and I put them online. I tweeted this to the Feedback office and to Susan. Susan's response was, oh gosh, I haven't heard that in years, and it's lovely to hear it.
And from the Scottish capital, Norman King.
Susan's accent is that of an educated Scot. She has beautiful diction, and her reading of the shipping forecast is a work of art, both in enunciation
It does go to show how, really, over the years, the concerns of the listeners haven't really changed.
Got a treat for you, Mr. King, but it's not for you sailors.
Rockall, Malin, Hebrides, Minches, north to northwest 4 or 5, occasionally 6 in Malin, Hebrides and Minches. Fair, good.
Very good.
Many thanks, Andrew. Well above and beyond the call of duty. For most of you, all we ask for is your comments, positive, negative or neutral, on anything to do with BBC Radio and policy. Here's Susan Ray again to explain the numerous ways you can get in touch.
You can write to us at Feedback, P.O. Box 67234, London SE1P 4AX, or you can leave a phone message on 03 333 444 544. Standard landline charges apply, but it could cost more on some mobile networks. You can send an email to feedback@bbc.co.uk, or you can tweet at BBC R4 Feedback. All of those details are on the feedback pages of the Radio 4 website.
Inimitable. I wonder if she can vote in the referendum, by the way. Now, compared to just a minute, Miss Ray is Radio 4 arriviste. Nicholas Parsons had already been chairing the panel show for 16 years before Susan first appeared on the network. Over the years, the programme's stalwarts, Derek Nimmo, Clement Freud and Kenneth Williams, have passed the baton on to the likes of Paul Merton and Julian Clary to maintain the show's reputation for repetitionless repartee. But now there's a new younger breed waiting in the wings to take their place. I'm not talking about any up-and-coming talent spotted at this year's Edinburgh Fringe. These wannabes are considerably younger and smaller than that. All this week, Radio 4 Extra's been running a series of Junior, Just a Minute, in which the competitors are all aged between 11 and 13. Two of them, Kitty Fry and Zre Shula-Pruka, have given us their account of the experience.
When I found out I was first going to be on the programme, at first I just couldn't believe it. And then, as it began to dawn on me, I was so excited. I was ecstatic, just bouncing off the walls, saying it over and over again.
I was so excited, and I was jumping around the house, but then I started to get a little bit nervous because I realised how hard it was actually going to be, but I was still really excited.
We trained for the Junior Just a Minute, and my mum used to pick really boring subjects and I had to try and make them interesting.
My dad helped me with training for Just a Minute, and we just sat on the bed and we went over it over and over again, and I just got used to it. On the day of the recording, we came up and me and my mum went shopping at the beginning, which was very exciting. And then we got there and I started to get very nervous.
Some of my most memorable moments, my first one was going into the green room because there were mirrors all over the place and refreshments, and I actually felt like a film star.
Welcome to Junior Just a Minute.
I'm falling asleep. Then my dad comes to get me again and tells me off over and again.
But one of the best ways of getting rid of hiccups is drinking a glass of water backwards. It actually does work. Fill up the said instrument with H2O, lean over the sink.
I think the most memorable moment in Just a Minute was when I completely copied Josie Lawrence's part on hiccups. The way to get rid of hiccups is to drink a glass of water backwards. What you need to do is pick up the said instrument and fill it with H2O. Then you slip over the side. Although those people listening on radio can't see, everyone was just looking at me open mouthed. Some of them were laughing in disbelief because it was completely outrageous what I was doing. I was stealing someone else's material.
Well, I've got to tell you, that is a first ever. Nobody in the history, 46 years history of Just a Minute, has taken somebody else's material and recycled it.
I couldn't believe it. I thought, what a cheat at the beginning. And I thought, why didn't I do that?
And, of course, there's nothing in the rules which say you can't do that. So I'm going to give you a bonus point for that. I think you deserve it.
I think it was really exciting the first time, and I want to do it over and over again.
Yeah, same. It was really fun, and I want to be a radio star. And the experience was amazing, and I don't want it to end.
We hope you've enjoyed the show, and we'll tune in again when we play Junior Just a Minute.
Scarily impressive. Watch your back, Paul Merton. And on the subject of backs, David Dimbleby now has a tattoo on his of a scorpion. Perhaps you might suggest a suitable tattoo for me and tell me where to put it. Goodbye. This is a download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Hello. Did you know that the new Director of Public Prosecutions in England and Wales makes a mean tarte-tatin? Do you care? Last week's Radio 4 profile spent a large proportion of the programme discussing Alison Saunders' baking skills, leaving many listeners simmering with rage.
Or is there really nothing to explore about the woman, apart from her baking ability and love of Beyoncé? The programme left a nasty taste in my mouth.
The programme's editor tells us why the programme spent so much time talking cakes, not cases.
Her oldest friend told us that in order to deal with the sort of rather grisly nature of the kinds of cases she's had to deal with, she focuses her energy into cooking and baking and entertaining as a kind of escape. So it is relevant.
Also, a poignant return to the airwaves for Andrew Marr, as he restarted, in part a matter of conjecture, could be momentous for everyone living in these islands. For example, if Scotland does vote yes, there will be no United Kingdom, at least as presently constituted, for Northern Ireland to be part of. And what will happen to the British Broadcasting Corporation? There will be just one simple yes-no question. Should Scotland be an independent country? And the BBC has promised extensive coverage of what it calls the biggest story in Scotland's history for 300 years. But it also knows that campaigners on both sides will be minutely examining every aspect of that coverage for perceived bias, not to say self-interest. It's going to be a tricky balancing act. And the man charged with ensuring that the BBC maintains due impartiality on the issue is the BBC's chief political advisor, Rick Bailey.
It's clearly of greatest interest to the people who are voting next September about the future of Scotland, but it is also about the future.
Let's start the week.
Hello. In the 10 years to 2011, the number of people in this country who defined themselves as Christian dropped from...
Many thanks to Andrew for making it back to Radio 4.
And how to speak for 60 seconds without hesitation, deviation or repetition when you're only 12 years old.
Then my dad comes to get me again and tells me off over and again.
More from Kitty Fry later. But first, your starter for 10. Will English, Welsh or Irish people be able to vote in Scotland's independence referendum? The answer is yes, if they are resident in Scotland. Will all Scots who are 16 and over get a referendum vote? No, not if they reside outside Scotland. Not many people know that, but they will if the BBC has anything to do with it. The referendum is only 10 months away, and its consequences...
of the United Kingdom. And we've already seen, for instance, last week, with the story about the shipyards and Portsmouth, for instance, that what's happening in Scotland does have reverberations around the UK. And it's not just about yes or no in the question of the Scottish referendum, but it's a whole series of other things, and we'll want to explore that. In covering this, we'll have lots of impartiality issues, and it'll absolutely be the BBC's objective to be impartial in this. It's vital that we're impartial in this. It's a really important, critical moment, and we have to be impartial, but we mustn't make that see everything through just this sort of yes-no political prism. There are so many more aspects to it.
But how can you be impartial when, in a sense, the future of the BBC is at stake? Because there can't be a British broadcasting corporation, can there, with an independent Scotland?
That clearly is one of the issues that comes out of independence. There are lots of British and UK institutions which our journalists, and indeed the media as a whole, will want to look at in the context of what's happening in Scotland. I think it's very important that the BBC as an organisation doesn't get involved in that debate and waits until people have actually voted and heard what they have to say. But that doesn't mean BBC journalists won't want to get into those issues about not just the future of broadcasting, the future of economy, the future of the military and so on. All of those UK institutions are part of the story, and we'll want to get into them.
But if I'm in Scotland, one of the questions I might want the answer to is, what will happen to broadcasting if there is independence? And therefore I'd be expecting the BBC to outline its plans for itself in the event of a yes vote. Will you do that?
No, absolutely not. It's absolutely legitimate, of course, to ask those questions, and our journalists may well ask that and explore it in the same way as they would explore any other of those questions. But I don't think the BBC as an organisation should risk entering that fray until people have voted, because that, I think, would risk the BBC's impartiality.
Can we then look at the programme making? Now, Radio 4's just run a 5-part series on the